Eric has asked, "Hi Tick, I was curious as to your thoughts on the constant counterattacks and counter-offensives conducted by the Red Army in 1941 and 1942. Were these counterattacks a deliberate strategy of attrition or merely the result of the Stavka overestimating the Red Army's abilities and a cult of the offensive mindset? Were the large losses this offensive posture incurred on Soviet soldiers worth the effort they had on the Wehrmacht? Did Stalin play a large role in influencing this strategy, or was this something ingrained in the Soviet High Command's mindset and operational doctrine? And would a defensive posture, specifically in 1941, have better suited the Red Army, or was buying time the best option for the USSR? It seems that most traditional sources write off the Soviet counterattacks as Red Army incompetence, while others like Glantz argue it was a strategy of attrition. As with most things in history, I'm sure there is no clear-cut answer, so I would love to hear your thoughts on the matter." During the first week of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet mechanized corps lost something like 90% of their tanks. And we know, if you've watched some of my previous videos, that the tank or mechanized formations weren't that great anyway. Yes, they technically had enough tanks, but they didn't have any trucks, they didn't have enough ammunition, some of their tanks didn't have guns that had rifles, so they were just firing shells inaccurately. They didn't have enough fuel, they didn't have any mechanics, so on and so forth. The Soviet industry had overproduced physical tanks, but not the equipment to support them, not the trucks for the infantry, not enough artillery, so on. The Air Force, I've already covered that as well, was pretty bad. Even though, again, they had enough planes, technically, but most of them were terrible, and those that weren't, the crews weren't trained to use, so on and so forth. So again, in the first week or two, you just have a complete disaster. So you could probably argue that in the first 2 weeks, let's say, the initial reaction was deep battle doctrine, yes, cult to the offensive mentality, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, we need to counterattack right away and smash the Germans and ride off to Berlin. So that is the initial reaction, and then it results in the Battle of Dubno and so on, and annihilation. However, once you go beyond the first 2 weeks, no, it doesn't make any sense. Rereading When Titans Clashed by Glantz, who you do mention, what I'm seeing here when I read some of the examples of these counterattacks probably can be best described as desperation. Page 74, during the first few days of the war, there was no strong central control. And Glantz goes on to talk about how Stalin may or may not have had a breakdown, but on page 75 he says the problem lay not in the ability to make decisions, but rather in assembling information and communicating the resulting decisions. Stalin's military advisors fanned out from the capital as soon as the war began in a frantic attempt to learn what was happening and establish some control of the situation. And he says it was only by August a rough system had evolved. What the Soviets are trying to do is not necessarily counterattack and go all the way to Berlin. It's actually just to create a front line and actually stabilise the situation and stop this juggernaut of a German offensive coming towards them. And so if you imagine it this way, if you've got two armies and one of them's falling back because of pressure, or that's where the Schwerpunkt is, what's the other one going to do? Just sit there and be like, oh, let's have a nice cup of tea? No, they're going to try and counterattack. And so that's what you see happening. And you see it over and over again throughout 1941 and throughout 1942, Soviet units that aren't directly in the line of the Blitzkrieg, let's say, are counterattacking desperately to try and take the pressure off those units that are in the line of fire. During the July period, the Soviets were rebuilding their forces, and from page 70 of Glantz he says all these new formations had shortages in tanks, communications, anti-tank weapons and anti-tank guns. Senior commanders changed positions on a daily basis and their staffs lacked experience in coordinating the different arms and services. The new Red Army units had little opportunity to prepare for battle and often arrived piecemeal after long deployments by rail and dirt roads, resulting in uneven performance. A little further on he says, on the 6th of July, 5th and 7th Mechanized Corps, supported by 2 rifle corps, sacrificed themselves by launching frontal attacks against 7th and 17th Panzer Divisions. He explains that this attack went in with insufficient reconnaissance or infantry armoured cooperation, and obsolescent tanks of these 2 corps were easy prey for the standard German anti-tank screen, and in all 832 tanks were lost in this battle, after which the remnants withdrew in some disorder. So it's not like they had time to really prepare for this attack, and even if you granted that on day 1 of the campaign they decided, okay, we're going to do this, they only had, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks to actually prepare this at most. Well, they clearly didn't. They only had a couple of days. On page 70 to 71, he talks about Timoshenko's counteroffensive, which actually manages to encircle most of 8th Panzer Division and destroy about half of its force. He says, unfortunately for the Soviets, however, their aging marshal produced an overly centralized plan that did not allow for the problems of his green formations. Before the Red Army units could concentrate to attack, the continued German advance had almost preempted Timoshenko's concept. So the Germans are attacking, and the Soviets are trying to dilute the strength of the German spearheads, the Schwerpunkts, by attacking on the flanks or elsewhere in order to draw formations away from the Germans' main effort. And so because of this, they don't have much time to prepare, they're just having to send them in pretty much straight away. And this is why you're seeing remnants being used, and troops going in having only just got off the trains. So on the 13th of July, the 21st Army, supported by the remnants of 3rd Army, attacked, and this is Timoshenko's advance, and they attacked the southern flank of Guderian's advance, seeking to drive a wedge between the panzers and the German 2nd Army marching to catch up with them. At roughly the same time, Konyev's 19th Army counterattacked, literally as it dismounted from railroad trains on the 11th to 13th of July. And Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group basically dissolved that army by the 13th of July. And Glantz concludes, because of the failure of most of these counterattacks, the coordinated nature of Timoshenko's effort went unnoticed by Hitler and the OKH, as well as by post-war historians. But you can get a sense of the desperation. The fact that Konyev is having to send in his forces as soon as they dismount from trains clearly proves that they haven't had time to do reconnaissance, get their guys all organised properly, they're going in piecemeal, and this isn't the only time this actually happens. As you'll see in Stalingrad episode 4, which I have been working on, I just haven't got around to finishing it off yet, because December's one of those months, let's put it that way. You will see that the Soviets do the exact same thing. Troops are literally delivered onto the battlefield from the trains and go straight into action on the trains. I won't spoil any more for you, but that happens in episode 4, coming soon. So this isn't a rare thing. Also, on the next page for Glantz, he says Rokossovsky assembled a motley collection of shattered units and stragglers around the cadres of the 38th Rifle and 101st Tank Divisions, the latter reduced to only 40 obsolete tanks. Despite constant Luftwaffe airstrikes, Rokossovsky's scratch force halted 7th Panzer Division from the 18th to 23rd of July 1941, and then joined a general counteroffensive the next day. So again, you've got remnants, you've got some green troops being added in from reinforcements, you've got a small amount of tanks, very uncoordinated. They're going in, they're getting annihilated, they're joining on these bigger offensives and whatever else. But the point is that none of this sounds like, oh yeah, we took a week to prepare, we've gathered all our artillery and tanks, we've really sat down and thought about this. No, it's going in desperately, in a desperate way to try and stop, desperately, the German offensive. On page 73, Glantz explains this. He says, although uncoordinated with respect to their timing, these attacks placed immense pressure on the invaders and caused frightful casualties on both sides. They ultimately failed because of poor and often non-existent coordination between infantry, armour and artillery, weak fire support, and an almost total lack of logistical support. And most of this is due to the fact that there was such haste in trying to get these offensives to actually start there and then. Now, you could argue, okay, maybe they did overestimate the Red Army's abilities a little bit, and you could say that, Stalin didn't fully understand, therefore he thought his units could do better than they actually did. But I would argue that the high command on both sides didn't really know what was going on at the ground, and this is a fundamental problem when it comes to any big hierarchy. I've worked in retail, I'm sure many of you have, and I'm sure many of you have worked in other corporations. The guys at the top don't really know what's going on the front lines, right? They don't know if you're working in a shop and you're interacting directly with the customer. You know what's going on more so than some numpty, a mile away, right? So, and you see this if you ever go to Pizza Hut or Nando's. Nando's is the best one. The staff come over to you and they're like, "Hey, how was your meal?" And it's like they deliberately time it so that you're just taking your bite as they come over, because they don't really want it's lovely, right? They don't want to really, it's terrible, give me another one or whatever. No, they don't really care for that. And you as a customer, or certainly I don't care that they're asking me how my meal is. Like, I'll tell you afterwards. I don't want to know. I don't want to be telling you during the middle of a bite. So why do they do that, right? I don't want it. The customer doesn't want it. The guy serving you or waitering upon you doesn't really want to do it, and yet they have to. Why? Because some numpty from millions of miles away at the top of the hierarchy wanted to know, hey, are the customers happy? Well, the only way to know is to ask them in the middle of their meal, right? Some guy, again, who's no idea what the hell's going on in the real world, living miles away behind the front lines, needs some sort of feedback mechanism or wants to build it into it because they don't know what's going on. And that's why you get stupid orders trickling down from the high commands of any corporation or any big business, any government, anything like that. That's why you get these orders, because they have no idea. The guys in charge have no idea. They're not serving on the front lines. They're not seeing it. So in that initial period, you get the same sort of situation. The Stalin, but the Stavka, Zhukov, these guys don't actually really know what's going on in the front line. And so they're just kind of sending out orders, hopefully, trying to get information back through a system of command and communication, which doesn't work. And even if it does work, it's not feeding back the right results, okay? Because, we've ticked the box, we've asked the customer, are you enjoying your meal? I was, until you interrupted me, right? So it's like that, and it's like, we're counterattacking. And you actually, in fact, you see this in, when the Germans initially break through the line at Kletskaya, Kolpakci doesn't tell the high command, by the way, this division, 192nd Division, is falling back. He doesn't tell them that. He just ignores it. Then, when he has to finally admit that it's actually happening, he's like, but don't worry, the 40th Tank Brigade is counterattacking. And it's like, yeah, okay, but that's not giving a realistic picture to the Stavka. We understand why Kolpakci did that, because he doesn't want to get shot, but at the same time, it's like you're not giving them accurate information. And so the high command are left in the dark, and they're not getting, they're getting a rosy picture. Yeah, everything's fine at the front, don't worry about it, right? And then at the same time, they're then basing their decisions on stupid feedback. And so they're not actually giving you the orders that you want, and you're not giving them the information that you need or they want, because both are not working there's no unison there. So you say, did Stalin play a large role in influencing this strategy? Well, yeah, obviously. And was it something ingrained in the Soviet high command's mindset? Yeah, because they're left in the dark. That's why. The large losses that occurred in the Soviet side was not worth the cost. And this is why, it was a deliberate strategy of attrition. Well, hold on. The point of attrition is that, maybe both sides are losing guys, clearly. However, the point is that you want to damage the other side more. And I don't think any commander, like if I've got an army, I want to lose that entire army, but don't worry, I'm going to do half as much damage on the enemy. Like, no, you want to do as much damage to the enemy and as little damage to your own side as possible. That's like, basic sort of strategy in a sense. Yes, you can possibly lose more men, but you wouldn't want to do that. It makes no political sense, makes no sense at all to do that. And so why would they choose to, oh, it's okay, we've got this strategy of attrition and we're going to deliberately lose constantly, and we're just gonna be really terrible in our tactic. Like, why would you wouldn't choose that? And so I don't think that that's what they did. I think they chose to desperately counterattack constantly because they had no choice, or they didn't feel like they had a choice. One army or two armies or whatever are getting beaten, and so the other armies that are not have to attack, got to attack back. And even those armies that are getting beaten back, they have to attack as well. And the whole point is to try and stabilise the situation in 1941 and 1942. Again, I mean, you see this, we haven't got to it yet in Stalingrad campaign, but you will see it at Kotlebane, right? Chuikov is getting squeezed at Stalingrad, or Lopatin, or whoever was in charge exactly when they first started, and Zhukov is headbutting basically Weitersheim's Panzer Corps, the north of Stalingrad, and he's doing it over and over again. And the reason why is because he's desperately trying to take the pressure off the 62nd Army inside Stalingrad. So it's like, oh, it's a deliberate strategy of attrition. Like, that's what they might say after. They might say that after the event, but the reality is during the event, it's not. It's a, we think we can counterattack. We need to take the pressure off the enemy's troops. Again, you see it in with the tank armies outside the Don. The Germans break through the lines. There's an encirclement. The Soviets are desperate. They're like, we can't just let this encirclement die. We might have an opportunity of encircling the Germans ourselves. Let's do it. Let's go ahead. So they counterattack. It's really badly organised. If you're going to mount a counterattack, you would wait a couple of days. You would gather your supplies. And yet that's not exactly what, they've just come off the train, send them in. And that's what they do. They do it every single time. They did it on the Don. They do it at Kotlebane. The guys on the ground, the generals of the rifle divisions, whatever, saying, look, we just need another day or two just to give us a couple of days to plan this offensive properly. And Zhukov's like, okay, I'll give you 6 hours. It's like, no, we need more time. He's like, no, attack. And the reason why is because he's desperately trying to prevent 62nd Army from getting destroyed. So he has to, it's a desperation. It's not, we're gonna do this properly, we're gonna, build up our forces and overwhelming strength. It's like, no, we have no choice, go now, because the situation elsewhere is bad. No general, what sounds better? We did an official deliberate strategy of attrition to wear down the Axis forces, or we were getting beaten so badly we had no choice but to send in waves of untrained conscripts with very little ammunition and fuel, and the tanks were breaking down and blah, blah, blah. You wouldn't say that, would you? No, you want to put as good of a face on it as possible. And so they came up with excuses. Oh, well, our doctrine said we had to attack, so we did, Then the question comes, well, is it incompetence? And there certainly is an argument there. Page 76. Many of the initial Soviet defeats were the direct results of the inexperience of the surviving Red officers. Field commanders lacked the practical experience and confidence to adjust to a rapidly changing tactical situation. Instead, they tended to apply stereotyped solutions, such as distributing their subordinate units evenly according to textbook diagrams, without regard to the actual terrain. The result was forces that were not focused on the most likely avenues of the German advance, and that attacked and defended in such a stylized and predictable manner that the experienced Germans often found it easy to counter or avoid such blows. He goes on a little later. Headquarters at every level lacked trained staff officers to coordinate manoeuvre, fire support, and logistics. A little later he says, there were exceptions of course, but the overall performance of the Red Army hierarchy was so poor that it contributed to the confusion caused by the surprise attack. And then a little later, Soviet staffs also lacked effective communications to control their subordinates and report the situation to their superiors. Even the military district headquarters, which upon mobilization became front commands, were short of long-range radio equipment and skilled operators. Existing Soviet codes were so cumbersome that commanders often transmitted their messages unencrypted, providing ample tactical intelligence for the German radio intercept units. Page 77, Glantz concludes, in other words, the Red Army had too many headquarters and layers of command for the available trained staff, officers and communications. Moreover, the initial defeats caused the average strength of divisions, corps and field armies to decline so catastrophically that the remnants no longer needed an elaborate hierarchy of headquarters that remained. Newly formed units were equally short of specialised units such as tanks, anti-tank weapons, engineers and anti-aircraft guns. All this suggested that the organisational structure of the Red Army required a drastic simplification. And this lack of communication keeps Stalin and the headquarters of the High Command and other headquarters as well completely in the dark in what is actually happening on the front lines, which makes the situation worse because they're like, well, everything must be rosy, let's send in a counterattack, and it's not rosy and everything is going wrong. So yes, we have instances of incompetence and we have a lot of green units and the officers aren't particularly well trained in this situation or not experienced enough. So there is that element to it, but this is made monumentally worse by the bad communications and the inability to coordinate their units and just a general lack of information on what is going on. And this is multiplied by the desperate situation, the desperate need to stop the German offensive in its tracks. So then you ask, and would a defensive posture, specifically in 1941, have better suited the Red Army? Or was buying time the best option for the USSR? The problem in 1941, the Soviet, you hear about, oh yeah, they formed 285 formation divisions. It's like, okay, but they weren't fully equipped. They didn't have enough artillery. They had no air support, or very little. They had tanks, but they weren't great tanks. They were in fewer numbers after the initial annihilation, so on and so forth. And they didn't have the mechanised forces and the mechanics, etc., to keep them in the field. They still had a lack of trucks, blah, blah, blah. So they are trying to form lines, but they're not able to do so. So I don't think that they didn't have a defensive posture. I think they were on the defensive. It's just counterattacks were necessary, or they thought it was necessary, in order to maintain the defence. In theory, you would want to maintain a purely defensive posture, so a passive defensive posture, until you're ready to actually attack. And so it makes sense in theory to do that, but the reality on the ground appears to be a little bit different than that. If it was me, I would let troops retreat, try and keep them operational rather than wear them down through pointless counterattacks, which is what actually happened, and do it that way. I would adopt that strategy. The Red Army didn't do that. Which one is better? Well, I would argue that the passive defence would force you back further, at least in the short term, but it would allow more troops to be mobilised in the long term. I think any commander worth his salt wouldn't send his troops in to a counterattack unless they were ready. The only time you wouldn't is if you had no choice, or you felt you had no choice, or you were ordered to do so from somebody else who thought there was no choice but to attack. I think if they had had the passive defensive option, they would have taken that. But it appears that they didn't have that option. There was a reason why in each case that they had to conduct counterattacks when they did. So again, if you look at the Stalingrad situation, you could say 1st and 4th Tank armies had to counterattack because Group Zaravlev was surrounded. It looks like you can possibly break through Weitersheim's corps, whatever, and get to Zaravlev, or maybe just surround Schlomer. So it's like, well, we may as well attack, but if in theory you'd go, well, let's wait a couple of days, make sure all our tanks are here. They didn't even do that. But you would do that. Normally you would go, yeah, we're going to properly prepare and then attack. But they don't do that. They throw it in piecemeal and it all goes wrong, blah, blah, blah. So they only did that because they were desperate to stop the Germans. On page 108, Glantz talks about the counterattack at Moscow in December, and he says most Soviet units were mere skeletons, although the survivors were more experienced than in previous battles. They did succeed in concentrating the forces though, and he says at the bottom, the winter campaign began on the 5th of December 1941. Driven by necessity, the Stavka at first sought only to repel the German pincers threatening Moscow with limited counterattacks. However, when the first attacks achieved success near Moscow, Soviet ambitions soared quickly. Within weeks, the fronts and armies from Leningrad to the Black Sea received far more extensive missions, trying to advance all along the front. By early January, an overall concept had emerged that would govern Soviet operations for the remainder of the winter. Yet the hasty formulation and often clumsy execution of this concept meant that the spectacular early gains did not lead to the desired strategic results. This is also backed up by Fritz in the book Auskrieg, which is a great book, by the way. On page 200, Fritz says that, yes, there were new reserve units that were moved to the front, mainly from Siberia, but he says these troops were admittingly badly trained, poorly equipped, inexperienced in combat, and led by officers with little training or experience. But they were there, at a time when just the appearance of new enemy formations had been enough to panic the depleted German forces. He says that Zhukov stressed to the dictator that it was time for the attack to begin, and Stalin agreed and sanctioned the attack. But he says, ironically, in the first 2 days of December, it appeared as if the Soviet action might have come too late, due to the fact that the Soviet line had been broken. And towards the bottom it says, the initial Soviet intent was modest, to force the enemy away from Moscow in order to eliminate the immediate threat to the capital. The Soviet plan originally aimed not at the large-scale encirclement and destruction of German forces, but merely at biting off the 3rd and 4th Panzergruppen, as well as the 2nd Panzer Army to the south. So as you can see, it was a limited, desperate action to try and keep the Germans away from Moscow, hit them on the flanks, just counterattack. But then, because the Germans are at the end of the tether, it actually achieved some success. And so then Stalin's like, right, let's evolve this, let's keep it going, let's reinforce it. And so this, just like many of the other counterattacks, was meant to have been, started off as a limited counter-attack, and then it evolves into a counter-offensive, which then goes almost to a strategic level. So this wasn't we've got a cult of the attack mentality, or we're going to try and cause as much attrition as possible. Yes, the Germans had suffered the attrition already, so yeah, it's had the benefit of that, but the initial idea for these counterattacks, including the Moscow counteroffensive in the winter of 1941, the whole point of this was to just keep the Germans back, push them back, and stabilise the situation. That's all it was, and then it evolves into something more than that. So this is why I think the word desperate or desperation really best describes Stalin, Zhukov, and all the generals, especially in 1941-42. Once the tide of war has changed, obviously, then yeah, okay, maybe they're going for the attrition, maybe they're going for something else. But in this initial period, desperate counterattacks, desperately trying to stabilise the situation, it makes more sense than saying, oh, it's attrition, or it's the call to the offensive mentality. There were times where the Soviets did actually prepare their attacks, but they weren't really counterattacks. Kharkov 1942, the Soviets prepared their summer offensive, and then the Germans counterattacked technically, but they had actually prepared it as well and annihilated the Soviets. But in theory, that was the first real time. The second time they do it is Operation Uranus at the end of the Stalingrad campaign. Now, it's often said it's a counter-offensive. I don't think it is. I don't think you can count that as a counter-offensive, because yeah, there was an attack going on in Stalingrad, but there was no attack going on the Don front. So is that really a counter-offensive? I think that was a deliberate offensive, and you see this for the first real time. The Soviets take months to plan that offensive, or at least weeks to plan that offensive. They wait until they've got the resources gathered, so on and so forth, and then they strike. And guess what? It wins. It does well. Okay, yeah, they're attacking Romanian forces, but you get the point. They prepared in advance. They take the time. It's not like Kotlebane. They take the time. They plan it through meticulously, and it works. So when the Soviets have time and have the ability to gather their strength and plan properly, they can actually do a decent offensive. So when in 1941 and 1942, at least before Uranus, why that doesn't happen, the reason why is because they're in desperate situation. They have no choice but to attack. They do attack. They attack stupidly, incompetently. It leads to attrition, but it's done because they have no choice. The desperate situation. And then maybe after the war, they went, yeah, we had a cult of the offensive mindset. We had the strategy of attrition, which was deliberate, and we planned this in advance, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that happened. I think they just were desperate and they just wanted to save face later on. But I could be wrong, as I usually am. Stick to tanks. So let me know in the comment section below what you guys think. And since it is 2 days before Christmas, I'll let you have an opinion. I'm offended, triggered. You wouldn't tell it was Christmas, would you? With no decorations behind me. Bah, humbug. So yeah. Anyway, let me know. Merry Christmas, guys. And I'll see you just before New Year. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.